next day, Knulp stayed in bed. He still felt rather weak, and in any case, he would hardly have gone out of doors in such weather. In the morning, when his friend dropped in, Knulp told him not to worry about him, just to bring him a dish of soup at lunchtime. All day, he lay quiet and content in the dim light of the attic room. The cold and weariness of the road seeped away from him, and he basked in a feeling of sheltered warmth. He listened to the regular thudding of the rain against the roof, and to the fitful gusts of the warm, soft wind. Now and then, he dozed off for half an hour, and occasionally, as long as it was light enough, he leafed through his travelling library. A few sheets of paper on which he'd copied poems and sayings, a bundle of newspaper clippings, and a few pictures that he had cut out of magazines. Among these, he had two favourites, which were creased and worn from frequent handling. One was the actress Eleonora Duse, and the other a sailing boat at sea in a high wind. From boyhood, Knulp had felt drawn to the sea and the North Country. For several times he'd made a start in that direction, and once had gone as far as Brunswick. But time and time again, a strange anxiety and homesickness had driven this migrant who was always on the move and could never settle down anywhere, back to South Germany by forced marches. His carefreeness seemed to leave him when he found himself in a place with a strange dialect and customs, where no one knew him, and it was hard for him to keep his legendary road book in order. At noon, the tanner brought him soup and bread. He entered the room quietly and spoke in a frightened whisper. He thought Knulp must be sick, for he himself had never lain abed in daylight since the days of his measles and chickenpox. Knulp, who was feeling fine, didn't bother to explain, but merely said he would be well and up the next day. Late in the afternoon, there was a knock at the door. Knulp was dozing and made no answer. The tanner's wife tiptoed in, removed the empty soup dish, and put a bowl of coffee in its place on the stool beside the bed. Knulp had heard her come in, but whether because he felt lazy or merely out of caprice, he kept his eyes closed and gave no sign of being awake. Standing there with the empty dish in her hand, the young woman cast a glance at the sleeper, whose head lay on his arm in its blue-checked shirt sleeve. Struck by his fine dark hair and the almost childlike beauty of his carefree face, she stood a while looking at the handsome young fellow about whom her husband had told her such strange stories. She saw the bushy eyebrows on his clear, delicately modelled forehead, his thin brown cheeks, his fine red mouth and slender neck, and she liked what she saw. Well, she thought of the days when, as a waitress at the Ox, a springtime fancy would come over her, and she would let a handsome young stranger like this one make love to her. Thoughtful and slightly aroused, she leaned forward a little to see his whole face. The tin spoon slid off the plate and fell to the floor, and what with the stillness and embarrassing intimacy of the place, she was scared to death. Knulp opened his eyes slowly and unsuspectingly, as though he had been sound asleep. He turned towards her, shaded his eyes with his hand for a moment, and said with a smile, "Why, it's Frau Rothfuss, and she's brought me coffee. A nice bowl of hot coffee, the very thing I was dreaming about. Thank you, Frau Rothfuss. By the way, what time is it?" 4, she said quickly. "Now drink it while it's hot. I'll come back later for the bowl." And out she ran, as though she hadn't a moment to spare. Knulp looked after her and listened as she hastily descended the stairs. His eyes were thoughtful, and he shook his head several times, and then he let out a soft bird-like whistle and turned to his coffee. But an hour before dark, he began to feel bored. His health was restored, he was wonderfully rested, and he wanted company. Contentedly, he got out of bed and dressed, crept down the dark stairs as quietly as a cat, and slipped out of the house unnoticed. A damp wind was still blowing from the southwest, but the rain had stopped, and there were clear spaces between the clouds. Sniffing at the air, Knulp sauntered down the darkened street and across the deserted marketplace. Then he stood in the open doorway of a blacksmith's shop, watched the apprentices cleaning up, and while warming his hands over the dying forge fire, struck up a conversation with the journeyman. He inquired about various acquaintances in the town, about deaths and marriages. The master took him for a fellow blacksmith, for Knulp knew the language of every trade and the signs by which its practitioners recognized one another. Meanwhile, Frau Rothfuss was making her evening soup, fiddling with the iron rings of the little stove and peeling potatoes. When she had finished and the soup was safely simmering on a low fire, she took the kitchen lamp, went into the big room, and stood before the mirror. In it she found what she had been looking for, a full face with fresh cheeks and bluish-grey eyes. Her hair didn't seem quite right, and with a touch or two of her nimble fingers, she put it in order. Then she gave her hands, which she had washed only a moment before, another wipe on her apron, picked up the lamp, and went quickly up to the attic. She knocked at the door of the journeyman's room, at first softly, and then a little louder. When there was no answer, she set the lamp down on the floor and opened the door with both hands, very cautiously, for fear it would creak. Then she entered on tiptoe, took one step, and ran her hands over the stool by the bedside. "Are you asleep?" she asked in a soft voice, and then again, "Are you asleep? I've come to clear away the coffee things." When there was no sound, not so much as a breath, she stretched out her hand towards the bed, but quickly withdrew it with an eerie feeling and went out for the lamp. Finding the room empty, the bed carefully made, and even the pillows and featherbed shaken out, she rushed back down to the kitchen in confusion, torn between fright and disappointment. Half an hour later, when the tanner had come in to supper and she'd already set the table, she began to worry, but she was afraid to tell her husband about her visit to the attic room. Just then, the outer gate opened. Soft steps passed over the paved corridor and up the winding stairs, and there stood Knulp. He took off his trim brown felt hat and wished them good evening. "Great guns!" the tanner cried out in consternation. "Where have you been? He's sick, and off he goes, running around in the night. You'll catch your death." "Right you are," said Knulp. "I see I'm just in time. Frau Rothfuss, I smell your fine soup way over at the marketplace. Well, that will keep my death away from me." They sat down to eat. The master of the house was feeling talkative. He sang the praises of his home life and the advantages of being a master craftsman. He teased his guest and then lectured him in earnest. It was high time that he stopped gadding about and doing nothing. Knulp listened, but said little in reply, and the tanner's wife didn't open her mouth. She was annoyed with her husband, who struck her as uncouth compared to the handsome and well-mannered Knulp. and she showed her good opinion of the guest by the attentiveness with which she waited on him. At the stroke of 10, Knulp said good night and asked the tanner to lend him his razor. "Did you ever see anybody so clean?" Rothfuss exclaimed. "The second his chin starts to tickle, his beard has to come off. Well, good night. I hope you feel better." Before going to his room, Knulp leaned out of the little window at the head of the stairs to take a look at the weather and see what was going on in the neighbourhood. The wind had died down, and between the roofs there was a black patch of sky, studded with clear, damply shimmering stars. He was about to pull in his head and close the window when, suddenly, the little window across from him in the house next door lighted up. He saw a small, low room very much like his own. A young servant girl had come in, holding a brass candlestick in one hand, and in the other a large water pitcher, which she set down on the floor. Then she held the candle over her narrow bed. Covered with a coarse red blanket, it was plain but neat, and invited sleep. She put the candlestick down, he couldn't see where, and seated herself on a low green painted wooden box. The typical servant girl's trunk. The moment this unexpected scene began to unfold, Knulp had blown out his candle, so as to avoid being seen, and now he stood quietly, peering out of his window. The girl across the way was the kind that appealed to him. She could have been 18 or 19, not very tall, with an attractive olive complexion, brown eyes and thick brown hair. Her pleasant, quiet face did not look exactly happy. All in all, she seemed rather woebegone as she sat there on her hard green box. And Knulp, who knew the world and young girls as well, had a pretty fair idea that the poor thing hadn't left her native village very long ago with her box, and was homesick. Holding her thin, dark-skinned hands in her lap, she sought brief comfort in sitting for a little while on her meagre possessions and thinking of home. As motionless in his window as she was in her room, Knulp peered with strange eagerness into this unknown human life, so innocently nursing its sweet sorrow in the candlelight, without a thought that someone might be watching. He saw her kindly brown eyes, now unconcealed, now covered by long lashes. He saw the red light playing softly over her dark, childlike cheeks, and as he watched her slender young hands on the dark blue cotton of her lap, he knew they were tired and resting a while before getting down to undressing, the day's last chore. At last the girl raised her head with its heavy, pinned-up braids, heaved a sigh, looked dreamily but no less sorrowfully out into the void, and then bent down to untie her shoelaces. Knulp was reluctant to leave his post, but it struck him as wrong and almost cruel to watch the poor child undressing. He would have liked to have called out to her and chat with her a while, to make some joke that would send her to bed a little happier, but he was afraid that she would take fright and blow out her candle if he called to her. Instead, he resorted to one of his many arts. He began to whistle. The sound was so faint that it seemed to come from the distance. He whistled the folk song, "In a cool green valley a mill wheel turns all day," and he managed to make his whistling so frail and delicate that the girl listened for some time without knowing quite what it was. It was only at the third stanza that she slowly stood up and went to the window. She leaned out and listened while Knulp went on whistling. For a few measures, she wagged her head in time with the tune, and then suddenly she looked up and saw where it came from. Is there somebody over there? She asked in a whisper. Only a tanner's apprentice, he answered just as softly. I didn't mean to prevent you from sleeping. I was a little homesick, so I thought I'd whistle a tune. But I also know some cheerful ones. Are you a stranger here too? I'm from the Black Forest. Ah, from the Black Forest. So am I. How do you like it here in Laechstetten? I don't like it at all. No, I don't know yet. I've only been here a week, but I don't really like it much. Have you been here long? No, only 3 days. What village are you from? You wouldn't know it. You never can tell, nor is it a secret. Achthausen. It's only a hamlet. Ah, but a pretty one. The first thing you see is a chapel. Then there's a mill, a sawmill, I think it is, and they've got a big yellow St. Bernard. Am I right or wrong? My goodness, that's Bello! And when she saw that he knew her village and had actually been there, the greater part of her suspicion left her. She perked up and asked eagerly, Oh, do you know Andres Flick? No, I don't know anybody there. That's your father, isn't it? Yes. Then you must be Fraulein Flick. And when I find out your first name, I'll be able to write you a postcard the next time I pass through Achthausen. Do you want to leave here so soon? Well, no, I don't want to, but I want to know your name, Fraulein Flick. But I don't know yours either. Well, I'm sorry about that, but it's easily mended. My name is Karl Eberhard. Now, if we meet in the daytime, you know what to call me. But what am I to call you? Barbara. Oh, thanks, that's fine, but it's a hard name to pronounce. And I'm almost willing to bet that they call you Barbara at home. Oh, yes, they did. But if you know everything, why do you ask so many questions? Anyway, now it's time to go to sleep. Good night, Tanner. Good night, Fraulein Barbela. Sleep well. And just because it's you, I'll whistle another tune. Don't run away, there's no charge. He started right in and whistled a flamboyant and yodel-like tune full of trills and turns, which leapt and sparkled like dance music. Amazed at his skill, she listened to the end. When he had done, she slowly drew the shutters tight and fastened them, while Knulp found his way to his room in the dark.